I'm Ann Mason, a member of the Program Committee of the National Railway Historical Society's Washington, D.C. chapter. And tonight, I'm your host. I'm assisted by Garen Goldsmith and Jim Perry. Our chapter's mission is to expand the public appreciation of railroads and their history through preservation and education. And we accomplish this mission by sponsoring a scholarship to the rail camp for a high school student, to preserve and operate our beloved 1923 Pullman car at the Dover Harbor. We've got a lot of great trips coming up this fall, so I hope that many of us will get out there on the roads. We maintain a railroad library at Bowie Tower. We publish the monthly newsletter, The Timetable. Another way we fulfill this mission is we hold these monthly virtual meetings, including tonight's event. And tonight, we have a guest introducer, Donna Dolan, another member of our program committee, will introduce our speaker, Reuben Moss. Over to you, Donna.
Hi, I'm Donna Dolan. I've been a volunteer at the DC chapter since 2012. We're welcoming today Reuben L. Moss. He's the current president and curator of the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway Historical Society. The H&S was founded in 1999. Reuben has been an enthusiastic volunteer at H&S since 2014. I first met Reuben at the annual Color Fest in Thurmont, Maryland, where he hosted H&F's rolling presentation to the public, set up beside the permanent display of Freight Motor number 5. Reuben continues to engage the public into H&F's history via his broad knowledge of H&F's important of a time past in the farming community, which was early Frederick County. And he represents H&F in trolley conductor regalia at other events, festivals, museums, libraries, etc. He and other volunteers also maintain a robust online newsletter, Trolleywire, and H&F's archival collection of over 1,800 artifacts on their past perfect software. Welcome, Reuben.
Thank you, Donna. So tonight I am going to be talking about the era of trolleys in Central Maryland. This was one large network, but to begin the story, I'm actually going to go and talk about the why, where, and how of the system before the system began. This will set a little bit of a groundwork for why the system existed and lasted as long as it did. So going back to 1811, there was an act of Congress which started the construction on the first federally funded road west from Cumberland. To connect this road, several turnpikes were formed between Cumberland and Frederick, with additional turnpikes from Frederick branching off to Baltimore and the district. Through this area, we know this as the Old National Pike. The road had served the communities with access to easier travel and the ability to transport goods to and from towns into the bigger cities nearby. Stagecoaches and other long-distance travel brought patrons to hotels in the cities as well as the communities of Boonsboro and Middletown. The relatively smooth road provided farmers a farther range for selling their produce and grains as teams of horses grew frequent over the mountaintop. Some parts of the road had not yet been completed, however, when there was a new form of transportation that appeared in the nation, and that was the railroad. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was formed in 1828 with the ambitious goal of connecting the ports of Baltimore with the Ohio River. The railroad had considered traveling west through Frederick, but there was a public distrust in the area and the new mode of travel, and there was a more level route along the Potomac River, leading the railroad to build along its competitor, the C&O Canal. However, Frederick still had much to offer as far as goods and services were concerned, as well as customers. And in 1831, the B&O built what some incorrectly claim as the one of the oldest train stations, but it was one of the world's first branch lines. An industrial area grew up alongside the creek in Frederick around this station. And the structure seen here, however, was replaced in 1910, only 4 years after this photograph was taken. In 1872, the Frederick and Pennsylvania Line Railroad, which was later part of the Pennsylvania Railroad system, built tracks right down the center of East Street, connecting with the B&O Railroad's yard at the 1831 station of the B&O, and building their own freight and passenger stations in town. And south of Frederick, in 1891, the Baltimore and Ohio began construction on what was to be known as the largest single railroad sorting yard in the country in the small community of Berlin, which was soon renamed Brunswick. This had been little more than a whistle-stop canal town since the railroad had first passed through in 1834. North of Frederick, the Western Maryland Railway had passed through the town of Mechanicstown, which would soon be renamed Thurmont. In 1887, another railroad was formed connecting the Western Maryland Railway here to the Revolutionary War era Catoctin Furnace, 4 miles to the south. This was meant to transport goods to and from the furnace, as well as workers back and forth between the two communities. This was known as the Monoxie Valley Railroad and was the first railroad in our story. Over the mountain in Hagerstown, there were so many railroad connections within a few years of that included the Western Maryland, the Baltimore and Ohio, the Norfolk and Western, and the Cumberland Valley Railroad, which also later became part of the Pennsylvania Railroad, that on maps, it appeared to some as if they were spokes in a wagon wheel, with the city as its hub. Today, Hagerstown is still known as the hub city for this very reason. Railroads were everywhere, and by the mid-1870s had taken away a significant portion of the transportation of long-distance goods over the road. The cost of maintaining that national road was very high, and it began to fall into disrepair, often being repaired by the locals and the farmers, rather than by the turnpike companies that had been started to collect tolls for its upkeep. This didn't sit well with the people of Middletown and the Middletown Valley, an area with abundant fertile farmland. They were at least 8 miles and a mountain climb away in every direction from the nearest railroad line, as much as a full day's trip depending on their horse team and cargo. They saw that farms closer to the rails were able to transport their goods to market in bigger cities, and manufacturers could transport goods almost anywhere in the nation, which meant they were all making larger profits if they were near the railroad. The people of the valley wanted a railroad of their own. In 1886, in Richmond, Virginia, a man named Frank Sprague, who had not only worked for Thomas Edison, but who had improved some of Edison's electrical systems, began his own company with a focus on practical electric motors and electric railway applications. Improving upon the designs and technologies by several other inventors from the years prior, Sprague's company constructed the first successful large-scale streetcar system in Richmond, Virginia in 1888. Sprague's Richmond Railway not only proved that electric power could be used for railroads, but that these electric trolley cars could actually climb steep hills previously limited to rail cars pulled by a moving cable like those in San Francisco. The residents of the valley learned of Sprague's Richmond Railway, and having heard rumors of steam railroads through their valley, which had never come to be, they decided to take matters into their own hands. It took almost 3 years of effort after a company was finally incorporated in 1893 to raise enough capital to begin construction. Despite the Middletown funding and the minimal support from the city of Frederick, it was Frederick where the construction finally began in the spring of 1896. On August 22nd, service began between Frederick and the top of Catoctin Mountain began. The trolleys stopped at an open grassy area where the company would soon after found a resort community to attract riders that they would name Braddock Heights. On the second day of operation to the Catoctin Mountaintop, so many passengers had ridden the trolley to the top that this 48-seat car, number 10, departed the top of the mountain with 110 passengers aboard. This included the entire board of directors. The car lost control and crashed halfway down the mountain, injuring many of the passengers. One widow did die later of her injuries. Following that hard-learned lesson, the railway had a relatively safe record for many years. Car number 11, the second car purchase, continued to operate the route, and car 10 would soon be rebuilt. Despite this incident, riders continued to enjoy the climb to the top of the mountain, where picnic grounds around an observation tower overlooking Frederick and Middletown both had been constructed. On October 12th, the Great Frederick Fair of 1896 was the first served by trolley. It opened and was provided with a new trolley stop at the front gate, attracting over 15,000 fares in that week. At that time, the company only had 3 trolley cars in operation. The trolleys finally reached Middletown, the town that had actually funded the route, a week later on October 21st. The cars didn't enter the town, however. Instead, residents had to walk over a quarter of a mile up a steep hill from the downtown area to reach the cars. This wouldn't be remedied for several months when a new station was constructed behind the tall Lutheran church, which is seen in this image of the town. More than passenger service, the people of Middletown had wanted the trolleys to transport farm goods out of their town and products for shops into the town. The third car, originally numbered 1, later renumbered 15, was purchased to carry passengers and to pull small freight cars over the mountain. This car would later be known as Old Mike. It's seen in this image along the National Road just east of Middletown. Less than a year after service began, the company found that Middletown was an even bigger business than they had predicted. The company had added 2 more flat freight cars to their rolling stock. This makes 6 and 1 boxcar beside 3 passenger cars. By 1913, the company boasted ownership of 60 freight cars and freight yard capacity in Frederick of 185 cars. By 1920, this number had decreased and their aged owned cars were no longer being exchanged with other railroads. In 1905, a small snowplow was purchased and numbered 3. It's seen in this image at the top of Braddock Heights. As you can see, it was also used for freight service as well as as a snowplow. 2 of the early flat cars mentioned earlier when I had the Old Mike picture up are seen loaded with sacks of grain and bales of straw being carried from Middletown to Frederick. 1898 also saw the connection to the town of Myersville. Following Middletown's lead, the people of Myersville had formed their own company and built track on their own from their town to this small station at the end of the Middletown line, leasing their track to the Frederick and Middletown for a portion of the revenue. And this is car 11 seen in this image. By this point, trolley systems were appearing nationwide, and while the Frederick and Middletown was forming, some other communities had begun building systems in their cities. Some larger cities had been using cable cars for rail cars, cable cars or rail cars pulled by horses, and many of these had also adopted the electric trolleys. In the early 1890s, the Martinsburg Street Railway had been formed in West Virginia. It was very soon after that William Jennings and Christian Lynch saw an opportunity to invest in Hagerstown and begin a lucrative business, starting a cheap electric trolley service. By August 8th, 2 weeks before the first town of Williamsport, 6 miles outside of Hagerstown. This line was of great use to industry commuters, as Williamsport had several different businesses and Hagerstown did as well. The company was also operating a figure-8 loop route around the city. The Hagerstown Railway purchased the 3 trolleys from the recently abandoned Martinsburg Street Railway to operate on their lines, one of which you can see in the image here. Eventually, they moved on and built larger cars. Trolley service from Hagerstown was extended through Funkstown and reached the town of Boonsboro in 1902. This was the Boonsboro Station and trolley shelter, where a car would be left overnight for the morning run. Boonsboro was known for its fruit exports, and local farmers were eager for a rail connection to transport cantaloupes, peaches, and raspberries to the city. There were plans to continue from this point to the nearby Antietam battlefield. However, it's unknown why that line was never completed. While the shelter itself is gone, the station building still remains and is actually a small trolley museum on its original site. Hagerstown's efforts to expand their network continued, and a route was built branching off halfway between Boonsboro and Funkstown at a place known as Wagner's Crossroads. Soon after that, this station was constructed in a little-known community called Smoketown. The community would soon after be renamed Mount Lena. A power substation was installed at the top of the mountain. However, very soon after, it was moved and added to the end of the building, as you can see on the left side of the image. After crossing the mountain, the Hagerstown route, funded by stock sales under the paper company name of the Hagerstown and Myersville Railway Company, traveled down the middle of Main Street in Myersville. This line joined with the end of the Frederick and Middletown route there, and through service between the two cities began on December 1st, 1904. The trip from one city to the other had taken up to 2 days by horse-drawn wagon, or a roundabout and pricey railroad trip of several hours. But now, thanks to the trolleys, the trip between the two cities could be done in only 2 hours. In 1906, the Hagerstown Company also added a line north from Hagerstown through several more small communities, including Paramount, which we see here, and Reed, which was north of that. This line crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, ending at a little town called Shady Grove, Pennsylvania. Here, passengers could transfer to trolleys when another company's route west to Greencastle and Chambersburg, or east to Waynesboro and the Western Maryland Railway's Penmar Park. This was the Chambersburg, Greencastle, and Waynesboro Street Railway. It was a wide gauge system, while the Hagerstown and Frederick routes were both standard gauge. Because of this, through service was never offered between the two systems at this point. In 1907, this station was constructed at the terminus of the new branch line from Braddock Heights to another small valley farm community known as Jefferson. While there was ample farm business available for this small line, the ultimate goal was to actually continue the route south from here to the railroad yard in Brunswick, where farmers from Loudoun County, Virginia, could bring goods across the river to ship by trolley to Frederick. Fearing competition while in the process of doubling the size of their railroad yard there, the B&O actually forced the cancellation of the line beyond this station, despite the fact that the town of Brunswick had already invested in installing their own trolley tracks through the center of their town. That same year, the Washington, Frederick, and Gettysburg Railway formed to take over the former Monoxie Valley Railroad. After the Catoctin Furnace had closed in 1903, there had been an attempt to make the route successful by connecting the line to Frederick and calling the line Frederick, Thurmont, and Northern, but that had been unsuccessful. From 1887 to 1907, two second-hand 440 locomotives, one of which can be seen here, had served as the motive power on this line. The Washington, Frederick, and Gettysburg was a far grander venture, meant to expand the route from Frederick down to Georgetown and north to Gettysburg. This was meant to provide a direct tourist connection from the nation's capital to the Gettysburg battlefield, which at that point had become a major tourist attraction. Part of the new brand included the purchase of two Forney-type locomotives and several new passenger cars, all from the New York Elevated Railway. We see one of the two locomotives and some of the cars here in this image. Only 2 years later, after no progress on further construction, the Washington, Frederick, and Gettysburg was sold to the Frederick and Middletown Railway, which was itself in the process of combining all of their subsidiary companies into one company, the Frederick Railroad. In 1911 and 1912, trolley wires were installed over the tracks to Thurmont, along with other improvements. And all of the steam locomotives on the line were retired. Seen here in this image is the first scheduled trolley to travel between Frederick and Thurmont. That was a period of great investment. By 1912, the Frederick Railroad had spent $180,000 on infrastructure improvements, an equivalent to over $5.3 million today. They built a new terminal, freight station, and trolley maintenance building, new painting facilities in Frederick, new stations at Braddock Heights and Middletown, and track and bridge upgrades across the system. With the growth of the trolley system, the companies needed to provide greater power output than the small power plants that had been built at Lee Street in Hagerstown, on East Street in Frederick, and alongside Hollow Creek near Middletown. In addition to the trolleys, the companies had also been providing electrical power to residents, businesses, and farms in the community they served, which also drove the need for power generation to increase. The Frederick Railroad and Hagerstown Railway decided to build a joint power plant along the Western Maryland Railway in a community known as Security near Hagerstown. The Frederick and Hagerstown Power Company was started in 1912 and the plant was completed in 1913. Not long after the plant opened, the companies decided to simplify their operations and merged at the end of 1913 into the new railway, the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway Company. The Frederick Railroad officers and management retained most of the control over this new system. The plant also replaced the power plant owned by the Chambersburg, Greencastle, and Waynesboro Railway. And while the building no longer serves as a power plant, it does still stand today. The red lines in the map were the completed Hagerstown and Frederick routes between 1912 and 1938. 87.5 miles of passenger service. The railway was thriving, and had it not been for legal obstacles and the work of the newly formed State Roads Commission between 1908 and the early 1920s, the system would have likely continued expanding. Not just the route to Brunswick, but also from Boonsboro to Sharpsburg, from West Washington Street in Hagerstown to the community of Clear Spring, and at one time, possibly to Smithsburg, just outside of Hagerstown. The orange lines are the proposed routes of those paths. That doesn't include the addition of 26 miles of line added when the Hagerstown and Frederick purchased the CG&W system in Pennsylvania in 1917. It was one of many companies acquired over that decade by the Hagerstown and Frederick as they expanded their electrical holdings. Across both the Hagerstown and Frederick and the CG&W, a significant portion of fares sold were passengers traveling for recreation. On the CG&W, the trolley system served the company's Cold Spring Park in Waynesboro, as well as climbing the mountain to serve the Western Maryland Railway's famous Penmar Park. And between passengers riding to these parks and regular commuters, the CG&W Railway boasted over 2 million fares in its peak year. Seen here is the station for Penmar Park. Hagerstown and Frederick riders around Hagerstown could take both trolley systems to the park, while Frederick passengers could ride to Thurmont and climb aboard a Western Maryland train. All three companies offered a joint loop ticket. Before construction on the Frederick and Middletown line, a 3-story observation tower had been constructed at the top of Catoctin Mountain, overlooking both Frederick and Middletown. Around this, the Frederick and Middletown constructed its own amusement park with a theater, a carousel, a skating rink, dance hall, miniature train, arcade, and several other rides and activities. At one time, even a retired Brill trolley car was set out as part of the playground. The Hagerstown Railway also served a privately owned amusement park in Funkstown for many years, and from 1920 to 1925, the railway owned and operated that park. The Hagerstown and Frederick also benefited from routes passing both the Frederick County and the Hagerstown City agricultural fairs. Fair month in October meant a drastic spike in ridership, with as many as 36 trolleys operating from each city square to their respective fairground, departing 1 per minute. At its peak in 1920, the Hagerstown and Frederick registered almost 3.8 million fares sold, over half of those being passengers to the fairs or amusement parks, and a portion being students riding to high schools in the city. That year, the fares are said to have exceeded both of Baltimore's streetcar systems combined. By that same year, however, the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway was also connecting electrical customers far beyond their rail system. This included customers as far south as Front Royal, Virginia, east as Mount Airy, north into Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and west to Frostburg, Maryland. In addition to generating the power, the company offered electricians to install wiring, lighting, and outlets into homes. They also opened storefronts and hired in-home salespeople to sell the latest electrical appliances. If you lived along the line, you could order a brand new Westinghouse waffle iron from the railroad and have it delivered by trolley. With all of these electrical customers, and despite that high peak ridership and the fact that the company was continually offering freight service, the railway was making 67% of their income off of their electrical services. Because of this, the company decided to reorganize, and the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway became a name on paper only, while the corporate entity became legally known as the Potomac Public Service Company in 1922. In 1923, construction began on the company's new flagship power plant at Williamsport, the modern design contrasting with the rather primitive-looking C&O Canal that was just going out of business at the time. The new coal plant would provide the core power for the area electrical system and would be expanded multiple times during over 60 years of operation. Not long after the Hagerstown and Frederick became the Potomac Public Service Company, they acquired another power network in Cumberland, which owned the local streetcar system. The Edison Electric Illuminating Company had recently rebranded to a shorter name, and the Public Service Company decided that name would be better for marketing. Thus, they renamed what had been the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway to be the Potomac Edison Company. In the 1920s and 1930s, trolley systems across the country were evolving to compete with the ever-improving automobile and the new automotive bus services. Modern streamlined looks and faster service were becoming standard in cities across the country. New streetcar designs with centered style doors became popular to speed up loading and unloading of passengers. Notably, the Peter Witt style cars in the 1920s that we see an example of here at the Baltimore Streetcar Museum, as well as the President's Conference Committee cars, or PCC cars, which were introduced in the 1930s. But very little changed on the Hagerstown and Frederick between 1913 and the late 1940s. No Peter Witt or PCC cars would ever run on the H&F tracks. The last trolley purchased new and kept by the company was delivered to Frederick in 1921, and the fastest and most modern car to operate the route were built for Cumberland in 1934. The common trolleys used on the H&F on every line were 40 to 48 passenger combines of various makes, which offered the ability to transport less than carload freight and express parcels, as well as their passengers. Unlike city systems, the entire system was single track with strategically placed passing tracks and sidings where the trolley would be scheduled to pull and wait for cars or freight trucks, each route in each direction, which was raised or lowered to always trail against the overhead wire on the back end of the car. All H&F cars had wheels on these poles, and none had the slider type that some more modern systems and PCCs would use. Most of these passing sidings, as well as some of the passenger shelters, were also equipped with phones so that crews could communicate with the dispatcher. At some point in the later years of operation, crews began to also be provided with standardized train orders identical to those used by the steam railroads. In 1932, the CG&W Railway was closed, with the line connecting Shady Grove to Hagerstown following soon after. Several of the trolleys were moved to the Hagerstown and Frederick line and placed on standard gauge trucks due to a demand for more cars. As the Frederick line had begun with a severe crash, twilight years of the main line between Frederick and Hagerstown would be remembered for a similar incident. On January 26, 1936, former CG&W car number 35, seen here, was operating on the main line heading west. As it descended on the western slope of South Mountain around 6:10 p.m., Motorman Clyde Watchell lost control of the car and was unable to slow the combine, no matter what efforts he took. Just before a sharp turn at a road crossing, the motorman jumped free of the car in time to avoid the impending disaster. The car ripped itself from its trucks and wires and crashed into a waiting shelter, which you see in this image, alongside a road on the mountain. It continued sliding for nearly 100 feet before stopping against a rock. Witnesses at the nearby Mount Lena station reported that the pair of trucks flew past the station at high speed, eventually coming to a stop almost a mile away from the wreck. The sole passenger on board was a company warehouse employee and an extra train man named George Victor Fraley, who had been visiting his family at Catoctin Furnace that day. He did not jump from the car in time and was killed instantly. Both men's families had considered being on the trolley that day and by chance had different reasons for not joining their men. It was less than 2 years later, in the October of 1938, the trolley service ended between Myersville and Funkstown. The line was not closed because of the wreck, but rather because the state of Maryland strayed a road, and it would have crossed the railway at 7 places, 4 of those being on the mountainside. Car 151 and motorman Lester Smith were the last to operate a car on the Boonsboro branch line when that route over the mountain was closed. He's seen in this image about a block away from the station just before returning to Hagerstown for the last time. By now, the company had been investing in bus services, owning both the local and the regional services, with buses being maintained in the same car barns as the trolleys. Trolley tickets would be considered valid on those buses traveling between Boonsboro and Hagerstown, as well as the other communities, until they expired. City Loop service, which had operated since the teens using these single truck near side cars in both cities, had stopped in the late 1920s, having also been replaced by those buses. In Frederick County, Myersville became the end of the line once more. This would last until 1945, when the need for maintenance and the need for additional power converters to be moved to Frederick led to the abandonment of the line between Middletown and Myersville as part of the support for World War II. Washington County continued to see trolleys operation between West Washington Street and Williamsport through World War II until August 4th, 1947, when the last 3 trolleys left the square and deposited dignitaries and special guests at William. The brightly colored buses were waiting to take them back to Hagerstown, inaugurating the beginning of bus service in Washington County as well. Frederick remained busy after the mainline closure. With gas rationing, passenger service saw an increase in riders, and while the company would never again see as many fares sold in the early 1920s, there were many full cars during the 1940s, especially in mornings and evenings when students rode the cars to school. The war brought a drastic increase in freight service. The railway served over 20 industries in Frederick, with direct sidings to these industries, as well as being the only rail interchange with the on-base U.S. Army Railway at Fort Detrick. In 1945, the Army also constructed a metal salvage facility directly alongside the Hagerstown and Frederick tracks on the edge of Frederick. They contracted the railway to bring vehicles and scrap metal salvaged from the war front to this facility via the Western Maryland Railway. During the war, it was a common sight to see electric freight motors, or on rare occasion, the Fort Detrick diesel locomotive, pulling trains loaded with damaged Army tanks, airplanes, and other frontline salvage through the streets of Frederick. This included ally and access material alike. Residents recall that occasional gondolas loaded with damaged helmets brought solemn reminders of the dangers facing the troops overseas. This increase in freight operation led to the purchase of several new freight motors and electric locomotives, including a box cab from the Washington and Old Dominion Railway that had begun life supposedly as a boxcar. It also included a 52-foot former Baltimore and Annapolis freight motor, the largest motor to ever run on the H&F system, and 2 electric steeple cab locomotives, numbers 10 and 12. Jefferson service ended in the mid-1940s, and it would not be long after, and only 1 month after Hagerstown service ended, that Middletown and Braddock Heights trolley service also closed. Like Hagerstown, the closures were forced by the creation of one-way streets on roads that the railway had been traveling in both directions for years. J.G. Brill Interurban number 172 had been the last trolley to leave Hagerstown and was then moved to Frederick to replace 2 cars that were damaged in a cow-related collision a few months earlier. It was still wearing faded last trolley in Washington County wording when it carried the last passengers from Middletown to Frederick. By the 1950s, only 172, which was built in 1921, and the 1919 built sister car 171 were the only passenger units left in service on the line. And so both would travel back and forth between Frederick and Thurmont, passing around the halfway point in Lewistown. Despite being the last 2 cars, one or the other would still occasionally be rented by railfan groups wishing to have a day to ride the line and stop to take photographs along the route, which had become a time capsule of electric railway history. This included groups from the NRHS, as well as the Electric Railroaders Association, which is a similar organization dedicated to electric-based railroads. This also included groups from Washington, D.C. Have an image here of 171 with an NRHS special image in the window, passing Clifton Station halfway between Frederick and Braddock Heights. On February 20th, 1954, both of these cars left the Frederick shops together on one final round trip. On the way back, students at Hood College presented company president R. Paul Smith with flowers and sang songs in tribute to the trolleys. The right-of-way crossed right through the school's campus, and for decades, many students had been riding to school and school picnics aboard the trolleys. Bus service replaced the interurban system that morning, but it too was abandoned only a year later. Freight service on the route continued after passenger service ended, however, and freight trains continued to rumble down 5th Street in Frederick. Because the creation of one-way streets had isolated Potomac Edison's trains from customers on South Street, trackage rights agreements were made with the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had tracked down East Street, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which interchanged with the H&F and Pennsy, roughly in the area of today's Mark commuter station for Frederick. Once the wires were added to this route, this allowed the much-needed connection to freight customers on South Street. But by 1956, the electric freight motors had been replaced by 2 ex-Army Whitcomb diesel locomotives, and every bus company was sold off. Tracks around Thurmont were removed in 1958, and by 1961, only a few sidings around East Street remained, which were sold to the Pennsylvania Railroad. All that remained was the electrical system. Every non-utility operation had been sold. So I'll now talk a little bit about the impacts on the communities that were served by the railway. There were about 24 different communities. When constructed, the system in central Maryland provided a connection between communities and people that was desperately needed. For the prospects of increased ridership, the company promoted social activities and festivals, which brought people together and helped to build communities. The railway and electrical system provided hundreds of jobs in the area and helped to boost the economies in every community that it served. As you can see in this image of Hagerstown Square, one of the open cars is advertising a baseball game and concert at the Hagerstown Fairgrounds. When the company began, consumer electricity was relatively new technology. While there were a few small power suppliers in the region, it was the railway which ultimately introduced the general public to electrical power for most of this area. The Hagerstown Railway even powered the first electric streetlights in the city of Hagerstown. Across the country, some agricultural communities would not see electricity until the late 1930s. However, in central Maryland, dozens of farms and communities were actually given the opportunity to use electric for lights and motors as early as 1896. What you see here is the extent of the electrical system and electrical partners during the 1940s. Both city and interurban trolley services provided more opportunities and a better life for area residents. Rural families had easier access to better paying jobs in towns and cities. Families could travel into the city for a wider variety of goods and foods, and students were offered discounted and later school board subsidized fares to ride to high school or college classes that for many without an automobile were too far away to attend, expanding educational opportunities for rural families into the mid-1940s when school bus service became standard. In a time when even automobiles were open to the weather and uncomfortable, trolleys normally offered a relatively smooth and luxurious ride, as long as you could tolerate some noise and a steady rocking back and forth. For some families early on, who would rarely visit friends and family because of the time, distance, and trouble managing horses and children alike, they could cross the county and make a visit and still get home again before the day was over. Work commuters found the cars reliable and safe. Only occasionally was a car late for its schedule. Commuter tickets allowed for a cost-saving opportunity as compared to cash fares. The crews, conductors, and motormen knew every regular passenger's name and stop, and many passengers knew their regular motorman pretty well. The interchange with the Western Maryland Railway that the Monoxie Valley Railway had constructed in 1886 and 1887 remained in service until 1958. And an interurban, while the passenger service was operating, would meet all of the Western Maryland passenger trains that stopped in Thurmont traveling east or west from Cumberland or from Baltimore. At these meetings, the two would exchange passengers and their luggage. In the cities, for a time, the electric railways would even employ porters and pick up passengers at their hotels so that they had a seamless transition on their journey in or out of the area. For a time, even goldfish raised in Lewistown and trout being sent across the state of Maryland to stock fishing ponds and waterways were shipped by trolley to Thurmont and carried in the Western Maryland baggage cars. Express packages and U.S. mail were also exchanged between the train and trolley during passenger exchanges, and mail and express service was operated on the trolleys from the very early days of operation. If you purchased goods or furniture in the city and lived near the line, the motorman would at times be willing to deliver right to your door rather than just to the nearby station. Much like today's parcel services, this system allowed people in the area to more quickly ship packages to and from anywhere in the country through a partnership with an express agency, or even locally along the route just through the company. This merchandise check, an example, tracked a February 10th, 1899 shipment of a package along the 4 or 5 miles from halfway to Williamsport on the Hagerstown halfway route. That cost a total of 30 cents that year to ship that by trolley. There was also a full freight interchange yard with the Western Maryland at Thurmont. The freight business, which grew out of this relationship in the very early years, helped to keep the trolley service in business and serving communities longer than it otherwise would have. Farms and industries throughout the region could ship goods by trolley, and the connection with the Western Maryland, as well as smaller interchanges with the Western Maryland and B&O, both in Hagerstown and the B&O in Frederick, allowed them direct access to shipping or receiving carloads and less than carloads of freight in and out of the area. Freight service was not limited to Thurmont or even just to the cities. Number 5 is seen in this image with a freight train at Middletown. While often thought of in Frederick, number 5 and several of the other freight motors used by the company were also seen across the entire system, occasionally photographed in Hagerstown as well. In Funkstown, near Hagerstown, the railway collected flour and dropped off coal for a local flour mill, and then exchanged them with the B&O a few miles away, just outside of Hagerstown. The freight had a great impact on the Valley farms in the Middletown area and their ability to send and receive goods. This September 25th, 1899 waybill shows that a farm near Middletown purchased 6¼ tons of fertilizer from a company in Frederick, which was delivered in one rail car, number 18, likely taking less than an hour to transport. 4 years before, that would have taken several horse teams or 7 days to transport in 7 to 10-hour trips over the mountain. Even after selling off most of their worn freight equipment in the late teens and early 1920s, the company maintained a small collection of some of these, which they used within the system to transport goods to and from towns into the city. 2 of those can be seen here on the siding at Mount Lena, where the local stores and farmers could send and receive goods to and from Hagerstown. Being standard gauge, the railway was, of course, capable of interchanging freight cars owned by businesses and railroads from anywhere in the country, which also came in handy for some of the businesses and farmers. For agricultural communities, this also meant the ability to transport refrigerated boxcars for produce and dairy products. One creamery in Middletown is even documented as having rented a refrigerated car for over a decade, making weekly shipments of Middletown Valley butter to Baltimore, where it was sold for a much higher price than it would have gotten even in Frederick. In Boonsboro, the cantaloupes and raspberries were often exported in bulk. However, they were more often documented as being shipped in less than carload quantities in the baggage compartment of the interurban cars, where sudden stops for animals on the track were known to topple the crates and roll the melons under the feet of passengers. Livestock could even be delivered by the trolley system if needed, either with a livestock car, as we see here, with one of the original Frederick Railroad Baldwin box cabs built in 1910 and retired in 1948, or, as was documented on at least one occasion, the company could transport a single calf in the vestibule of one of the passenger cars with the motorman. And of course, we can't forget that in its earliest days, the railway helped to shape the region physically. The presence of rails determined the placement of sidewalks and new roads as they were constructed. And we can't forget the railway's responsibility for the founding of an entire community in 1896, when they created Braddock Heights, designed to be a resort town for city tourists from DC and Baltimore to come to Frederick and ride the trolley up to the top of the mountain, increasing their interurban revenues. Nor should we discount the creation of one of the nation's early luxury streetcar suburbs, known as Airview, side of Middletown, that was founded around the same time. Just like a number of other railways in the country, very little now remains of the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway. But while nearly 70 years have passed since the last passenger interurban left Frederick, a keen eye can still find remnants of the line across the entire system. Much of the right-of-way remains visible, while the wording of deeds returned most of the route to its original owners. The power company does still maintain an easement, and nearly every original pole line remains the same today as it did while in trolley service. Even the berms and cuts, raised and lowered stone mounds in the track that the track were built on, along many portions of the main line over South Mountain, can still be seen despite being abandoned 8 decades ago. Nearly a dozen structures survive from the system as well. The Frederick Car Barn, seen here, which was built in 1910, is today the back warehouse of Potomac Edison's line maintenance complex in Frederick. While the street-facing front doors, which are seen in so many historic photographs, are hidden behind a modern office addition, they could still be found when you tour the inside of the building. The Hagerstown Car Barn, which began as a power plant in 1898 and was replaced by that security power plant in 1913, also survives, although it has also been heavily modified. It has an addition that was built to better maintain the company's buses for that town. The 1907 Jefferson Station still exists. It is used as storage for a feed store, and the waiting room has been minimally modified and now serves as a local art and decor shop, fittingly named the Main Street Trolley. Braddock Heights once had 2 stations, The station at the base of their amusement park there also served as the post office and as a power substation. It replaced the original amusement park shelter during 1910 upgrades, and today survives as a liquor store and an apartment building. Now used as a business with the front and side entrances bricked up, the 1919 Myersville Station still exists as well. It was attached to a general store, which can be easily found by a row of columns facing the main street. A station sign, which you can see here, still hangs over what was the doorway, showing the distances to Frederick and Hagerstown. The park beside this station was the site of the town's freight station, and today features the only surviving Frederick and Middletown era waiting shelter, which was originally located in a rural area a few miles east of Myersville. Frederick's terminal station stands today as well. This was where all the interurbans leaving the city boarded passengers. A track originally ran inside the center of the building, with a freight warehouse and indoor freight platform at the rear of the building. Originally, the track extended through the front of the building as well, flanked by the express office on one side and the waiting room on the other. This indoor platform was removed in the 1920s. Today, the structure is better known by local residents as the old Frederick News Post building, referring to the newspaper that bought the building and used it as their main headquarters up until sometime in the past couple decades. It's planned to become a restaurant and retail space associated with a proposed hotel along Carroll Creek there. The routes the trolley took through farmland still bear the power lines, the right-of-way itself now often worked into the fields, but the poles standing as markers. Slowly, the construction of developments out of Frederick have begun to force the relocation of some of these paths, but most of them remain today. Several of the electrical substations along the route originally spaced 2 miles apart to convert the generated AC power that the company transmitted over the long-distance lines into the 600 volts of DC power that was needed for the railway are still in use. Over the years, these have been upgraded and in some cases have been moved to more convenient locations. Seen here is the Yellow Springs substation. The stone structure once contained the switch that a neighbor was paid by the railway to flip every morning at 5 a.m. to turn on the trolley line. Car 171 is perhaps one of the most photographed of the passenger interurbans and one of the last 2 interurban cars to operate a revenue schedule in Maryland. It still survives as a private cabin north of Frederick. It's one of 4 survivors. This includes car 168, which is its sister car and the first of that model of custom steel body interurban built by the J.G. Brill Company. 168 is displayed at the Hagerstown Roundhouse Museum. The museum hopes to someday provide it with a desperately needed cosmetic restoration. Car 150 is an early Pearlie Thomas car and a design ancestor to the famous New Orleans cars. It primarily served the Boonsboro and Funkstown services out of Hagerstown, and now can be found inside of the town's community library in Myersville, where one can pick up a book off the shelf and sit inside of the trolley and enjoy it. And freight motor number 5, which was built in Frederick in 1920 out of spare parts and lumber, can be found on the former site of the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway's main station in Thurmont, only about a block away from the old Western Maryland tracks. Like so many other systems in the country, new highways and the availability of cars, trucks, and buses led to the end of the trolley in central Maryland. But their legacy remains. Today, people still pay their power bill to Potomac Edison in our area. The company may have changed drastically over the past 100 years, but the name still conjures up memories of green and cream rail cars and the sound of grinding gears for those who remember the service. The trolleys of the past may be gone, and more decades may have passed now than have seen the trolley operations here. Yet so many today continue to look back fondly at a simpler time. A time when the Hagerstown and Frederick trolleys crossed our countryside and made a lasting impact on the people and neighborhoods that shape our region. So as Donna said, I am with the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway Historical Society. We do maintain an archive. We also have friends with many other organizations. Some of them have provided some of the images for this presentation, but most of them actually did come from our archives. Some of the items in our archives you can view on our website, as well as an interactive map to see exactly where the route traveled through the region. So I am now open for the questions, Anne.
It would be great to go visit some of these places, like, maybe Myerstown where the old trolley park is, and see some of the old buildings, similar to what we did with the Chesapeake Beach.
There is a lot that you can still see.
Yeah.
At one point, and unfortunately, the vehicle that we had used for it is now no longer in existence. But not long before I got involved with the organization, they actually did a tour on one of those open air trolley buses of the right of way over a course of 2 days, and it was very well attended.
Well, that would be a really wonderful thing to do, John. Thanks for that recommendation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ruben, and thank you, Donna, for introducing Ruben. We have a couple of questions. So,
All right, I will try to answer them.
okay, great. Early in the presentation, in the Braddock Heights cars, we could see passengers leaning out of the windows. And then toward the end of the presentation in the 1930s, we also saw passengers leaning out of the windows.
Mm-hmm.
So did the early trolleys have windows? How did they keep out the inclement weather, rain, cold, snow?
Well, they had several different styles of car. Now, some of them were open air cars. They were nicknamed breeze scoopers, or as some called them, rain scoopers when it rained. They only had a screen on the sides that could be brought down to block out light and water. But they were primarily used in the summer. The majority of the cars that they used were closed cars, or with a lot of the interurbans, they were semi-convertible, which meant that the front and back windows could drop down into the wall, and the side windows could almost entirely be lifted up into the ceiling, so that it gave the impression of being in an open air car while it could still be closed off and heated in the winter or protect you from the rain.
Yeah, great. That's interesting. So what I've at least gotten from your presentation is that the interurban really created commerce between the businesses and farms that were really not served by any other mode of transportation, and that it also allowed towns to become populated and have a community that could interact between one town and another town, where it was very difficult to get reach on a normal once a day and return basis. So
yes, very much so.
So as the other modes of transportation put the trolleys, the interurbans, out of business, are there communities that were closed because of the lack of transportation?
No, because the company was also operating those bus services at the same time. At the time, when the trolleys were being abandoned, they had already been operating their buses on parallel schedules. Some of the timetables would even show trolley and bus schedules on the same paper.
Okay, so there's a lot of interest in going out and seeing the right-of-way. And you mentioned that the land would now deeded over to the original owners. So would people be trespassing if they were to walk some of the old right-of-ways?
There are a few portions that are public access. In Thurmont, they have about a mile of it paved. There is a goal to turn the Frederick to Thurmont route eventually into a trail, though that's hit a few residential roadblocks in one of the communities. And there's also a group that's looking to try to get the Middletown to Myersville route turned into a trail. But a lot of the right-of-way that you can access with, or you can see without trespassing, you're just seeing the crossings and you're looking across the field. But if you were to try to walk the right-of-way, it would be trespassing in a lot of locations. Some places I've gotten permission to go. I have been surrounded by cows the entire time I was walking. Example, very curious cows.
In other words, if you actually do get permission to walk on right-of-ways, wear muck boots.
Although
yes,
Thurmont
very
Trolley
much so.
Trail is not a problem.
No, that is not. That is
I've
not.
walked that trail.
You have a tremendous archive there at the H&F, and there's some interest by members of this community that's listening to you to take a look at some engineering maps. Do you have those in your archive?
Unfortunately, we do not. We have some digital copies of some of the right-of-way maps. The only original copies of maps that we've been able to find are actually in the collection of the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum.
Okay.
When Potomac Edison was bought by First Energy, who now holds a number of power companies in the region, they closed the company archive, and what could be salvaged went to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum.
Okay. Great.
But very little remains from the company records as far as drawings and things like that. Though sometimes we run across people with private collections that still have things that they, when they were in one of the company offices, one of the employees said, "Oh, you can just have that." So we've gotten some original documents and tickets that way.
That's great. That's great. Now, early you mentioned they had a wreck to start the whole trolley interurban system.
Day number 2 out of Frederick.
and another one to close the chapter of that interurban. And so there's some interest in knowing a little bit more about the brake systems. Were they air compressors, or were there's, did people put their, like the Jeffersons put their feet in their track and just sort of try to hold the forward momentum? What was the braking system like?
Well, the early cars, that first wreck, I'm not exactly sure what braking system that car had, but we do know that part of the problem was the pole came off the wire, so they had no power. So I'm wondering if they just adjusted the direction of power flow and tried to reverse it to slow the car down. Because they were very, very high torque motors. So I would think that they probably would glide pretty slowly until they kind of lost control there, lost power. But I know the second wreck, the majority of the cars that the line operated were air brake.
Okay, great. Well, that was a very fascinating conversation, and we thank you very much. And we are very appreciative that you stuck in with us in spite of your intermittent internet connection.
It was a wonderful. I apologize for that.
Oh, it was a wonderful presentation. Wonderful.
Yeah, and thank you very much for having me.
If you liked what you saw here, you can see it again when it's loaded up to the DCNRHS YouTube channel, as well as all of our other wonderful presentations that have been going on now for almost 18 months. So we have a really fine collection of railroading conversations, some of which you'll not ever hear by any other organization. They're pretty unique. So check out our YouTube channel. And with that, I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope it's been wonderful to see you all again. Thank you again, Ruben. And
you're welcome.
It was
And-
great.
and Donna for introducing Ruben, and thank you to Jim and Garen for your logistics and for you one and all to participate. We have one viewer who wanted to know if any of the H&F cars are preserved and where they might be.
Yes, there are four. One in Thurmont along the trolley trail that we mentioned. One in Myersville inside of the town's library. One is still a private cabin near Thurmont. And the fourth is at a museum in Hagerstown.
So there are four out of that vast.
There are four.
There are four. Wonderful. Wonderful. And thanks, everybody. Good night.